And you can see Carlsen successfully centralized his bishop. So that's why bishop to d6. And here white can continue with f4, defending this bishop. And if black decides to exchange the bishops, then since this knight is attacked, so that's why knight goes back to d7. And now most of you might get very worried about this f5 pawn, but it's not a big issue because white can easily simply push d4, and at the end you can see this exchange also connects and improve the pawn structure of white. Okay, so in the actual game, after bishop to d6, here Carlsen decides to brings his bishop back to b2, and after that, Hans shuts down the diagonal by pushing e5. And after that, Carlsen pushed f3, attacking this bishop, and for black, it's better to bring this bishop back to e6, but instead he made a mistake by bringing this bishop to h5. And guys, that's a huge mistake because now firstly, white can capture on d5 by c takes d5. And for black, it's better to just push this pawn to e4, trying to shutting down the diagonal of this light square bishop, because in the future this will create a huge problem to the black position. Because let's suppose if he instead of this, if he goes for knight takes d5, now comes g4, attacking this bishop, and after this bishop goes back, f4, attacking this knight, and obviously black cannot move this knight due to this rook. So let's suppose to defend this, if he decides to, let's suppose he goes back to c7 so that this queen can guard this. But here you can see black successfully defends this knight, but he cannot defend this light square bishop because of f5. Okay, so in the actual game, after bishop to h5, here Carlsen missed this amazing variation and instead he goes for. And you can see this h3 square will be a good outpost for this bishop. And since white can anytime push this pawn to g4 with the idea of h5 so that he can trap this bishop, so that's why here Hans decides to bring this bishop back to g6, avoiding any threat. Okay, so as you can see, now Carlsen is ready to push these pawns. So to stop this, here Hans finds the best move, which is knight to h5. And now obviously white cannot push this pawn to g4 due to the threat of knight to f4, attacking this queen as well as this bishop. And by pushing this pawn, you can see here white will create a weakness. So that's why he decided to bring his another rook into the game. And after that, rook to e2 by Carlsen. Maybe he's trying to double his rook. And after that, rook to g8 by Hans, preparing to push g6 so that white cannot place this bishop to f5. Okay, so now bishop to f5, asking for bishop exchange. And here black cannot push this g pawn because clearly you can see this will damage the safety of black king. So that's why here Hans decides to go for knight to h5. And now queen to c8, asking for queen exchange. And now for white, it's better to just exchange the queens because and then white can reroute this knight from f1 to h2 to g4, which will be a great outpost, and you can see this position will be better for white. But after queen to c8, here Carlsen blunders by the move queen to f5 check. And that's a blunder because after queen takes f5, and after takes, now comes knight takes g3, attacking this rook. And the only square left is even, and after that knight takes f5, and clearly you can see white is lost. But after queen to f5 check, surprisingly Hans missed that move and he goes for g6, giving a chance to Carlsen, and which obviously he did not miss. So he finally decides to exchange the queens. And now for white, there are multiple ways to continue this game. Like here, white can go for g4, attacking this knight, and if takes, rook takes f2 check, rook takes f2, knight to f4 check, bishop takes f4, e takes f4, knight to d2. And you can see this game will be equal. Okay, so in the actual game, after rook to f8, here Carlsen goes for king to h3. And you can see in the next move, black is threatening to capture on g4 with the idea of rook takes f3. So that's why here Carlsen brings his king back to g2. And after rook to g8, you can see the threat. So that's why king to h3 by Carlsen, and after that knight to h5, threatening knight to g3. So that's why here Carlsen brings his rook to g2. And that's a mistake by Hans because now white can go for rook to g2 with the idea of doubling the rooks. So let's suppose if black tries to exchange the rooks by rook to g7, rook takes g7 check, king takes g7, rook to g1 check, king to h7, and now comes bishop to f4, threatening bishop to c7 so that he can target this pawn chain. So to defend this, here if black goes for rook to e6, white can, however, go for bishop to c7, knight to h5, king to h3, rook to c6, targeting this bishop. So that's why bishop goes back to e5. And at the end, you can see white successfully creates a passer on the f file. By this, you can see this will be completely winning for white. But in the actual game, after knight to f6, here Carlsen missed that move and he goes for. And now here Hans made a mistake by rook to f6, allowing white to push f4, which initially is not possible if black keeps both rook on the e file, because then black can capture on e4. And that's a mistake. And now there's a mate in 3. Pause the video and try to find it by yourself. Ready? Here the move is king to f4. And in the next move, this pawn push will be a mate. So the only move is rook to e8, but simply e5 check, rook takes e5, and now comes the most fancy mate, which is g8 equal to knight. And yup, that's all. Okay, so but after king to f6, Carlsen goes for what an amazing game by both players. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.